The light in Boston did not fade gracefully in the autumn of 1773. It retreated as if surrendering the city to the cold, encroaching gray of the Atlantic. Eleanor Sterling stood by the bay window of Sterling & Company Horology, a small brass key cold against her palm. Inside the shop, the air was a symphony of rhythmic ticking, 100 mechanical heartbeats counting down seconds that felt increasingly fragile. Outside, beyond the thick, distorted glass, the world was holding its breath. She watched the shadows lengthen across King Street. They stretched from the brick facades of the merchant houses, reaching out like dark fingers to grasp the ankles of the passers-by. It was that peculiar hour, the gloaming, her father called it, when the day's labor was done, but the night's rest had not yet begun. In this liminal space, the city revealed its true nature. Eleanor turned the key in the lock of the front door, the heavy iron bolt sliding home with a finality that echoed in the quiet shop. She was 24, old enough to remember a time when Boston felt like a large, boisterous village, and young enough to feel the vibration of the coming storm in her teeth. She adjusted her shawl, pulling the rough wool tighter around her shoulders. The shop smelled of linseed oil, brass filings, and the faint, sweet scent of pipe tobacco her father had smoked before. The coughing sickness took his strength, leaving the business largely in her hands. "Good night, Papa," she whispered to the empty workshop in the back, though he was resting upstairs. She exited through the side alley door, stepping out onto the uneven ground. The cobblestones here were slick with a mist that had rolled in off the harbor, coating everything in a sheen of damp saline. These stones, rounded by years of cartwheels and winter frosts, were treacherous to the unmindful. Eleanor knew them by heart. She knew which stone on Hanover Street was loose enough to twist an ankle, and which patch near the old State House pooled with water after a rain. The sound of the city at twilight was a low hum, punctuated by the sharp clatter of hooves. A carriage rattled past, the horse's breath pluming white in the chilling air. Eleanor kept her head down, clutching her basket close. In recent months, eye contact had become a dangerous currency in Boston. One did not know if a glance would be met with the weary camaraderie of a fellow colonial or the sneering suspicion of a loyalist. She turned onto the main thoroughfare, intending to visit the market before the stalls closed. The sky above was a bruised purple, the last bleeding edge of the sun vanishing behind Beacon Hill. "Make way! Make way for His Majesty's Guard!" The shout came from behind her, sharp and imperious. Eleanor stepped quickly onto the narrow curbing, pressing her back against the rough brick of a warehouse. A patrol of redcoats marched past. In the dim light, their uniforms were drained of their vibrant crimson, looking more like dried blood. They walked with a heavy, deliberate cadence, boots striking the cobblestones in unison, a sound designed to intimidate. The rhythmic clack-clack-clack was louder than the ticking of her father's clocks. The soldiers did not look at her. To them, she was merely part of the scenery. Another drab colonial woman in a gray dress merging with the gray walls. But Eleanor watched them. She saw the tension in their jaws, the way their hands hovered too near their muskets. They were occupiers in a city that was slowly turning into a cage, and they knew the animals were restless. As the patrol faded into the gloom toward the harbor, the silence that rushed back into the street was heavier than before. Eleanor exhaled, her breath shaking slightly. She hurried her pace. The cobblestones seemed harder under her boots now, unforgiving. She needed to get to the apothecary on the corner of Union Street for her father's tonic, and then home. The market square was thinning out. Merchants were packing away their wares. Crates of late-season apples, barrels of salted cod, and stacks of wool. The mood was somber. There was none of the usual banter, the haggling over pennies that usually gave the market its life. People bought what they needed and moved on, heads bowed against the wind. "Eleanor." The voice was a low whisper. emerging from the shadow of a stacked cart. She started, nearly dropping her basket, but caught herself. She squinted into the darkening alley between a bakery and a chandler's shop. A figure stepped out just enough to catch the dying light. It was Julian Thorne. He looked different than he had at the Sunday services 2 weeks ago. His coat was dusted with flour, or perhaps ash, and his tricorn hat was pulled low. Julian had been her brother's friend before the smallpox took her brother, and in a way, he had become hers. But lately, Julian had new friends. Men who met in basements and spoke of rights and liberties. "Julian," she hissed, stepping closer to the alley mouth, but staying in the open. "You shouldn't be lurking like a thief. The patrols are everywhere." "Let them patrol," Julian said, his voice carrying a jagged edge of excitement that frightened her. "They can patrol the streets, but they can't patrol the tide." "What does that mean?" He glanced left and right, checking the flow of the pedestrian traffic. Satisfied, he stepped closer. He smelled of sea brine and tar. "The Dartmouth is in the harbor, and the Eleanor, and the Beaver." "The tea-ships," she said flatly. Everyone knew about the tea-ships. The tax, the refusal to unload, the standoff between Governor Hutchinson and the town meeting. It was the only thing anyone talked about, yet it was the one thing too dangerous to speak of aloud. "They won't leave," Julian said, his eyes feverish. "Hutchinson won't give them the pass to sail back to England. He means to land the cargo. He means to force it down our throats." "And what will you do? Stop a ship with a glare?" Eleanor asked, her pragmatism cutting through his fervor. "Go home, Julian. Your mother worries." He reached out, grabbing her wrist gently. His hands were calloused, rough against her skin. "I need you to take something for me. Just for tonight." Eleanor pulled back instinctively. "No, I am a clockmaker, Julian. I fix gears. I do not carry whatever sedition you have in your pockets." "It's not sedition. It's a list," he whispered, urgent. "Supplies, names of men who can be trusted if the port is closed. If they catch me with it, I hang. If they catch you. They'll just think it's a shopping list for the shop. Please." She looked at him, really looked at him. He was young, barely 22, but lines of exhaustion were already etching themselves around his mouth. The twilight was deepening into true night now. The cobblestones beneath them were turning black, absorbing the darkness. If she said no, he would carry it. He might be stopped. He might be hanged. "Give it to me," she said, her voice barely audible. Julian pressed a folded scrap of parchment into her hand. It was warm from his pocket. She immediately shoved it deep into her bodice, against the stiff lining of her stays. "You're a patriot, Elle," he grinned, a flash of the boy he used to be. "I'm a fool," she corrected. "Go." He vanished back into the shadows of the alley as if he had never been there. Eliana stood alone on the corner, her heart hammering against her ribs, right against the hidden paper. She felt suddenly heavy. Anchored to the spot, she forced her legs to move. "Walk," she told herself. Just walk. The twilight had fully surrendered now. The first lamps were being lit along the main street. The lamplighter, old Mr. Abernathy, was making his rounds with his ladder and torch. She watched him up ahead, a silhouette against the flare of the whale oil. Pop, hiss, glow. One by one, pools of yellow light spilled onto the cobblestones, creating islands of safety in the sea of dark. But tonight, the light felt exposing. It cast long, distorted shadows that seemed to dance and mock her. She hurried toward the apothecary, the soles of her boots clicking loudly. Click, clack, click, clack. It sounded too much like the soldiers. As she turned the corner near the Old South Meeting House, she saw a gathering. It wasn't a mob. Not yet. But a knot of men standing in the center of the street, blocking the way. They were arguing. "Tell you, the governor has ordered the sheriff to..." "Damn the governor, and damn his sheriff." Eleanor skirted the edge of the street, hugging the buildings. She didn't want to hear. She didn't want to know. She just wanted the tonic and the safety of her locking bar. But as she passed, she looked down at the cobblestones. In the flickering light of a nearby tavern window, the stones looked wet, not with mist, but with something darker. It was likely just slops thrown from a window or spilled ale. But in her heightened state of fear, it looked like ink. Or blood. She remembered the massacre. Everyone did. 3 years ago, on a night not unlike this one. Snow on the ground then. Not leaves, but the same cobblestones, the same soldiers, the same tension that snapped like a brittle mainspring. The blood had stained the snow red, and it had taken days for the city to wash it away. But the stain on the soul of Boston had never washed out. It had only deepened, seeping into the mortar of the brickwork. She reached the apothecary, bought the tonic with trembling hands, and practically ran the rest of the way home. When she finally reached the door of the shop, fumbling with the iron key, she felt a sudden drop in the temperature. The wind had shifted. It was coming from the north now, biting and cruel. She slipped inside and threw the bolt. Safety. The shop was dark, save for the embers in the hearth she had banked earlier. The ticking greeted her. A chaotic chorus of order. Tick-tock. Tick-tock. Eleanor leaned against the heavy oak door, sliding down until she sat on the floorboards. She pulled the parchment from her dress. In the dim glow of the fireplace embers, she couldn't read the names, and she didn't want to. She held it in her hand, feeling the weight of it. Outside on the cobblestones, the boots of another patrol marched by. The vibration traveled through the ground, up through the floorboards, and into her bones. The twilight was over. The night had truly begun. And, in the darkness of old Boston, Eleanor knew that the time for watching from behind the glass was ending. The gears of history were turning, grinding loud and heavy, and she, along with everyone else, was caught in the mechanism. She stood up, smoothed her dress, and walked toward the stairs to tend to her father. She placed the folded paper inside the casing of the grandfather clock in the hallway, the one place where time stood still, for the clock had not run in years. "Safe," she whispered, but as she looked out the window one last time, watching the gas lamps flicker in the rising wind, she knew that in Boston, safety was just a ghost story. They told themselves to sleep. Here is Chapter 2. The Lamplighter's Rounds. Note: writing a single continuous text of 3,500 words often exceeds the output limits of this interface. I have written a substantial, highly detailed narrative, approximately 2,000 words, that serves as a complete, immersive chapter. It focuses on atmospheric depth and historical texture to satisfy the American audience's appetite for rich storytelling. Shadows of Liberty. Candlelight in Old Boston. Chapter 2. The Lamplighter's Rounds. Silas Abernathy was a man composed of soot, whale oil, and silence. At 62, his spine carried a permanent curvature, shaped by 4 decades of carrying the ladder. It was a short, sturdy thing made of ash wood, polished smooth by the grip of his gloves. To the people of Boston, Silas was as much a fixture of the streetscape as the hitching posts or the iron pumps in the town squares. He was the keeper of the artificial day, the man who pushed back the Atlantic, night one glass pane at a time. He began his rounds at the base of Copp's Hill in the North End, just as the last bruise of purple light vanished from the sky. The wind was picking up, rattling the signboard of the Salutation Tavern, causing the painted figures of the 2 gentlemen shaking hands to creak in a ghostly greeting. Silas adjusted the heavy tin canister of spermaceti oil slung across his shoulder. It sloshed rhythmically, a liquid pendulum counting his steps. He approached the first post, planted his ladder in the mud, half frozen and crunching under the wood, and ascended. The world looked different from 6 feet up. From the ground, Boston was a maze of muddy hems, boot heels, and the knees of horses. But from the ladder, Silas saw the faces. He saw the anxiety etched into the brow of the baker locking his door. He saw the furtive glances of the dock workers hurrying toward the secret meetings in the sail lofts. He saw the way the British sentries tightened their grip on their muskets whenever a group of more than 3 men passed by. He opened the glass door of the lamp. The wind tried to snatch the flame from his torch, but Silas cupped it with a practiced hand. Touch, sizzle, bloom. The wick caught. A warm, yellow sphere of light pushed outward, revealing the damp brickwork of the nearest house. "Evening, Silas," a voice drifted from a window above. Silas didn't look up, merely touched the brim of his battered felt hat. "Mrs. Higgins, cold night for an open window." "Cold times, Silas, cold times." The window slammed shut. He descended, hooked his arm through the ladder, and mummed to the next post. The north end was restless tonight. As he worked his way down Fish Street, the air smelled of tar and old fish, but also of something sharper, tension. It was a physical weight. The clusters of men outside the taverns weren't laughing. They were leaning in close, their voices low, their eyes darting toward the harbor. Silas knew why. The ships. He had seen them earlier in the day, sitting heavy in the water at Griffin's Wharf. The Dartmouth, the Eleanor, they looked harmless enough, merchant vessels with furled sails, but everyone knew what was in their bellies. Tea, tons of it, the king's tea, and with it, the king's tax. To Silas, politics was a rich man's game played with poor men's lives. He didn't care much for the Whigs or the Tories. He cared about the price of bread, the ache in his knees, and the quality of his oil. But he wasn't blind. He saw the way the city was stretching, pulling apart at the seams. He reached the corner of North Square. Here the houses were finer, the streets slightly wider. He propped his ladder against a post outside the home of Paul Revere. The silversmith's shop was dark, but lights burned in the living quarters above. Silas could hear muffled voices. Many voices. An argument? No, a debate. Passionate and urgent. He lit the lamp. As the light flared, the front door of the house opened abruptly. A man stepped out, wrapping a heavy cloak around himself. It was Dr. Warren. Silas recognized him by his gentlemanly bearing and the distinct weariness in his eyes. Warren paused, seeing the lamplighter. For a moment the 2 men existed in the pool of yellow light, separated by class and cause, but united by the biting wind. "Master Abernathy," Warren nodded. "Doctor," Silas grunted. "Heading out?" "There is sickness in the South End," Warren said, though his eyes were too alert for a mere house call. "The city has a fever, Silas." "Best bleed it then, sir, or let it sweat." Warren offered a tight, grim smile. "We may have to do both." He turned and walked briskly away, his boots loud on the stones, disappearing into the dark, toward the Green Dragon Tavern. Silas watched him go. He wiped a smudge of soot from the glass pane of the lamp. "Bleed it," he thought. "That's what they're all afraid of." He continued his route, moving toward the town center. The neck of the city narrowed here, and the presence of the occupation became unavoidable. Near Faneuil Hall, the patrols were thicker. The redcoats, the lobsterbacks, as the street urchins jeered from safe distances, walked in pairs. These weren't the fresh-faced boys who had arrived years ago. These men looked hardened, bored, and dangerous. They were tired of the insults, tired of the cold, tired of a populace that looked at them with unmasked hatred. Silas set his ladder near the townhouse. A soldier was leaning against the post, picking his teeth with a splinter of wood. "Move along, old man," the soldier sneered, not moving an inch. Silas didn't speak. He simply waited. He had the patience of a stone. He stood there, ladder balanced, staring at the soldier's chest buttons. "I said, move," the soldier barked, straightening up. "Are you deaf?" "I have a duty clear as yours," Silas said, his voice like grinding gravel. "The town pays me to light this lamp so you can see who you're shooting at." The soldier's eyes narrowed. He took a step forward, hand dropping to the hilt of his bayonet. But his partner, an older corporal with a scarred cheek, grabbed his shoulder. "Leave it, Jenkins. It's the lamplighter. He's harmless. Besides, it's dark as a tomb out here." Jenkins spat on the ground, missing Silas's boot by an inch. He stepped aside. "Light it then, and be quick about it." Silas climbed. He took his time. He trimmed the wick with deliberate slowness, ensuring the flame was perfect. When he climbed down, he didn't look at the soldiers. He picked up his ladder and walked on. "Harmless," the corporal had said. Silas smiled into his scarf. Invisibility was a powerful weapon. Because he was harmless, he was ignored. And because he was ignored, he saw everything. He crossed into King Street. This was the site of the massacre 3 years prior. Silas had been lighting lamps that night too. He remembered the shouting, the confusion, the sudden, terrible cracks of the muskets that sounded like dry wood snapping. He remembered the smoke drifting through the light of his own lamps, and the way the snow had turned black and red. He stopped outside Sterling & Comey Horology. The shop was dark, bolted tight. He knew the clockmaker's daughter, Eleanor. A serious girl. Too serious. He had seen her earlier that evening, hurrying home with a face pale as milk. He had also seen the boy, Julian Thorne, slip out of the alley behind her shop, moments after she entered. Silas sighed. Young fools playing with fire, he thought. They think liberty is a song to be sung. They don't know it's a bill to be paid. He lit the lamp outside the Sterling shop, casting a protective glow over the door. His rounds took him further south, toward the wealthier district. Here, the atmosphere shifted. The smell of the harbor faded, replaced by the scent of wood smoke and roasting meat. The houses here were brick mansions, set back from the street. At the governor's mansion, the windows were ablaze with internal light. A party. Silas could hear the faint strains of a harpsichord and the high, tinkling laughter of women. He set his ladder against the iron gas post near the gate. Through the gaps in the curtains, he saw silhouettes dancing. Powdered wigs, silk gowns, crystal goblets. It was a different world. Inside, they toasted the king. A mile away, in the damp taverns of the North End, men were plotting to defy him, and Silas stood in the middle, on a ladder, cold and aching. As he finished the wick, he saw a carriage pull up to the side entrance of the governor's house. It lacked the royal crest. It was a plain black carriage. A man stepped out, a man Silas recognized instantly, though he wore civilian clothes. It was General Haldimand, the commander of the British forces. He didn't go in the front door to join the dance. He went to the side door where a servant ushered him in quickly. He was carrying a leather satchel, clutching it tight to his chest. Silas froze on his ladder. "The general here, at this hour." Haldimand should be at the barracks or the Castle William fortress, for him to come to the governor's house in secret during a ball. Something was happening tonight. Something more than just tea-ships bobbing in the harbor. Silas descended quickly. He needed to finish his rounds. The city felt suddenly smaller, the walls closing in. He moved toward the Long Wharf. The wind here was ferocious, coming straight off the Atlantic. It cut through his wool coat, biting into his skin. The lamps here were vital. Without them, drunken sailors would walk straight off the edge into the black water. He was midway down the wharf when he heard the scuffle. It came from behind a stack of crates labeled East India Company. "Let go of me," a boy's voice, young, panicked. "Hold still, you little rat. Turn out your pockets." A British accent, heavy, guttural. Silas paused. He was in the shadow of a warehouse, unseen. He peered around the corner. 2 soldiers had a boy cornered against the crates. The boy couldn't be more than 12. He was a courier, likely running messages for the Sons of Liberty, or just a local merchant. He was struggling, kicking at the soldiers' shins. "I have nothing. I'm just going home," the boy cried. "Liar!" one soldier hissed, grabbing the boy by the collar and lifting him onto his toes. "We know you lot are running signals. Where's the whistle, or is it a letter tonight?" The soldier raised a fist. Silas didn't think. He didn't weigh the politics or the risks. He just acted on the instinct of a man who had watched the city bleed enough. He took his heavy oil canister, unscrewed the cap, and with a heave of his old shoulder, hurled the contents onto the cobblestones, just behind the soldiers. Splash! The oil slicked across the stones instantly. Then Silas took his torch, the one he used to light the lamps, and tossed it. It wasn't a bomb. It wasn't an explosion. But when the fire hit the pool of spermaceti oil, it whooshed into a wall of yellow flame, 4 feet high, separating the soldiers from the main street. The sudden flare of light and heat startled the soldiers. The horses of a nearby cart reared up, whinnying in terror. "Fire! Fire on the wharf!" Silas bellowed, his voice surprisingly deep and booming. He stepped back into the shadows, grabbing his ladder. In the confusion, the soldier dropped the boy. "What in God's name?" The boy didn't wait. He scrambled under the soldier's arm, dived past the edge of the flames, and vanished into the darkness of the maze of crates. "Get him! No! Put it out! Damn it!" Silas was already moving. He walked. He did not run, for a lamplighter never runs. Quickly away from the scene, merging into the alleyway of a cooperage. He could hear the soldiers shouting, the alarm being raised. They would think it was an accident, or a prank by the mob. They wouldn't look for an old man with a ladder. His heart was hammering against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat that made his hands shake. He had interfered. He had crossed the line. He reached the end of his route at the edge of the common. The great elm tree, the Liberty Tree, stood as a massive silhouette against the stars. It was adorned with lanterns of its own, hung by the protesters, symbols of defiance that Silas had not lit. He had one last lamp to light, the one at the corner of Frog Lane. He set his ladder. His hands were still trembling, but he forced them to be steady. He climbed up. Below him, the city of Boston lay in an uneasy slumber. He could see the trail of lights he had left behind, a constellation of yellow stars mapped onto the dark earth. He had illuminated the path for the rebels, for the soldiers, for the doctors, and for the spies. He thought of the boy running into the dark. He thought of Eleanor Sterling and her hidden fears. He thought of the general slipping into the side door. The oil he had spilled was a waste. It would come out of his wages, but as he lit the final wick and the flame danced to life, Silas felt a strange warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the fire. "Let there be light," he whispered to the empty street. He climbed down, shouldered his ladder, and turned toward home. The rounds were done. But Silas knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the wind, that tomorrow night, the darkness would be harder to hold back. And soon, no amount of oil would be enough to keep the shadows at bay. Here is Chapter 3, Warmth of the Hearth. Author's note: to meet your request for a substantial novel-length chapter, aiming toward the 3,500-word goal, I have written this as a highly detailed, immersive narrative. Due to the length limits of a single response, this text is approximately 2,000 words. If you enjoy this depth, I can provide part 2 of this chapter to complete the full word count and conclude the scene. The fire in the hearth of the Sterling household did not roar. It muttered. It was a frugal fire, built from drift logs scavenged from the Back Bay mudflats and dried over the summer months. It popped and hissed with the memory of salt water, casting a fitful orange glow across the low-beamed ceiling of the kitchen. Eleanor Sterling stood before it, stirring a cauldron of corn chowder. The iron spoon scraped against the bottom of the pot with a dull, rhythmic sound that seemed to synchronize with the hundreds of ticking clocks in the shop beyond the wall. Scrape, tick, scrape, tick. The kitchen was the heart of the house, situated at the back, away from the street. Here, the biting wind that rattled the shop windows was muffled to a low moan. The room smelled of drying herbs. Sage, thyme, and rosemary hung in bundles from the rafters, mingled with the sharp metallic tang of brass that clung to everything her family owned. To anyone looking through the small, diamond-paned window, the scene would have appeared the very picture of colonial domesticity. A dutiful daughter preparing the evening meal, the copper pans gleaming on the wall, the warmth of the fire holding back the autumn chill. It was the peaceable kingdom that the ministers preached about on Sundays. But Eleanor felt no peace. The list Julian Thorne had given her, that scrap of parchment containing the names of men who would defy the king, burned against her mind as if she had swallowed a coal. It was hidden in the grandfather clock in the hallway, a mere 20 feet away. Every time a log shifted in the fire with a sharp crack, she flinched, expecting the heavy thud of a musket butt against the front door. "Is the chowder thick, Eleanor, or are we eating hot water again?" The voice came from the armchair near the fire. Arthur Sterling, master horologist, sat wrapped in 3 layers of wool blankets. His face, once round and flushed with the heat of the forge, was now gaunt, the skin clinging to his cheekbones like parchment. The coughing sickness had taken his lungs 2 winters ago, and while it had not killed him, it had left him a husk of a man who lived for warmth and order. "It has potatoes and salt pork, Papa," Eleanor said, keeping her voice steady. "And the last of the onions." Arthur grunted. He reached out a trembling hand to adjust the pendulum of a small mantel clock sitting on the table beside him. He was always adjusting. If a clock was fast, it offended him. If it was slow, it distressed him. To Arthur Sterling, the world was a machine, designed by a divine clockmaker to run on precise gears of hierarchy and duty. "The wind is from the east," Arthur murmured, his eyes on the fire. "I can feel the damp in my joints. It brings the ships in." Eleanor froze for a fraction of a second, the spoon hovering over the steam. "Yes, Papa, the ships are in." "Good." Arthur nodded, satisfied. "New stock. We need the mainsprings from London. The colonial steel. It's brittle. It has no temper. Just like these young men in the streets. All snap and no endurance." He looked at her then, his eyes sharp despite his illness. "I saw that boy today, the Thorne boy, lurking about the shop." Eleanor turned slowly, bringing the ladle to the bowls. She forced her hands to move with deliberate grace. "Julian. He was just passing by. He inquired after your health." "He's a trouble, that one," Arthur wheezed, accepting the bowl she offered. "I see the way he looks at the soldiers. He has the look. That hungry, wild look. It's a disease, Eleanor. Worse than the smallpox. It spreads through talk. It infects the mind before it rots the soul." Eleanor sat opposite him, taking her own bowl. The heat of the fire flushed her face, hiding the pallor of her fear. "He is young, Papa. He sees things differently." "He sees chaos and calls it liberty," Arthur snapped, splashing a bit of soup onto his blanket. "He and his ilk. They think if they tear down the roof, the rain will stop falling. They don't understand that the roof, heavy as it is, protects them." He ate in silence for a moment, the only sound the clinking of pewter spoons and the eternal ticking from the shop. Eleanor ate without tasting. Her father was a loyalist, not out of malice or greed or love for King George, whom he had never met. He was a loyalist because he was a clockmaker. He loved order, The empire was a great, complex machine that kept the world running. Trade flowed, laws were upheld, and time moved forward. The rebels, the patriots, as Julian called them, were sand in the gears. They caused friction. They caused the machine to grind and halt. "The tea," Arthur said suddenly. Eleanor looked up. "What about it? They say the mob won't let it land. They say they'll let it rot in the hold." Arthur shook his head, a gesture of profound disappointment. Waste. Such terrible waste. God provides the leaf. The king provides the ships, and these fools would throw it away over 3 pence. "It is not the 3 pence, Papa," Eleanor said softly. She shouldn't speak. She knew she shouldn't. But the paper in the clock seemed to be whispering to her. "It is the principle. The representation." Arthur laughed, a dry, rattling sound that turned into a cough. He hacked into his handkerchief for a full minute while Eleanor waited, her heart aching for him despite their divide. "Principle," he gasped finally, wiping his mouth. "Principle is a rich man's luxury, Eleanor. For the rest of us, there is only survival. You think Sam Adams cares about your principle? He wants power. You think Hancock cares? He wants lower duties on his smuggling. And what happens to us? To Sterling and Company, when the port closes, when the soldiers burn the town? Who fixes the clocks then?" He leaned forward, the firelight casting deep hollows in his eyes. "We keep our heads down, Ellie. We do our work. We pay our tax. We survive. Promise me." Eleanor looked at her father. She loved him. He had taught her how to hold a file, how to temper brass, how to listen to the heartbeat of a machine. He wanted her safe. "I promise to keep us safe, Papa," she said. It was a carefully worded lie. Later that evening, the wind howled louder, shaking the wooden shingles of the roof. Arthur had retired to his bed upstairs, the exertion of the argument exhausting him. Eleanor remained in the kitchen. She had the distinct feeling of being watched, though the shutters were drawn tight. She washed the bowls in a basin of warm water, drying them with a rough linen cloth. The house felt too large and yet too small. Every creak of the timber settling sounded like a footstep. She needed to check the list. It was a foolish impulse. The safest thing to do was to leave it exactly where it was until Julian came for it. But paranoia is a persistent itch. What if it had fallen? What if the ink had smeared? What if her father had found it before she came home? She dried her hands and took a tallow candle from the mantel. Shielding the flame with her hand, she walked into the narrow hallway that connected the kitchen to the shop front. The hallway was cold. The grandfather clock stood at the far end, a looming sentinel of dark mahogany. It was a masterpiece, built by her grandfather in 1720. It had not run since the day her mother died, 10 years ago. Her father refused to fix it, and he refused to let Eleanor touch it. "Sometimes are best left unmeasured," he had said. She approached it, the floorboards groaning under her feet. She opened the narrow waist door of the clock case. There, wedged between the silent pendulum bob and the backboard, was the folded parchment. She let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. It was safe. She reached out to touch it, just to be sure. As her fingers brushed the paper, a heavy pounding on the front door of the shop shattered the silence. Boom, boom, boom. Eleanor jumped, nearly dropping her candle. The flame guttered, casting wild shadows against the wall. "Open up! Sterling! Open up!" It was a man's voice. Rough, urgent. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. Soldiers. Had they seen Julian? Had they found the list? She quickly shut the clock case. She blew out the candle, plunging the hallway into darkness. "Who is it?" she called out, her voice trembling. "Open the door, girl. It's Master Galt." Galt, the blacksmith from 3 doors down. A neighbor. Eleanor rushed to the shop door. She fumbled with the heavy iron bolts, her fingers stiff with cold and fear. She swung the door open. Thomas Galt stood there, framed by the swirling night. He was a massive man, his leather apron stained with soot, his face pale beneath the grime. Behind him, the street was empty, the gas lamps flickering violently in the gale. "Master Galt, what is it? Is it a fire?" "Worse," Galt grunted, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. He pushed the door shut behind him and leaned against it, breathing heavily. "You need to hide your tools, Eleanor. And your brass." "What?" "Well, the mob," Galt said, his eyes wide. "They're moving through the South End. They're marking houses. Anyone who buys British. Anyone who took the governor's side in the meeting today." We didn't go to the meeting," Eleanor stammered. "Doesn't matter," Galt spat. "Your father fixed the clock in the customs house last week, didn't he? They know. Someone saw the invoice. They're calling him a friend of the tax." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. "But it was just a job. We fix clocks, we don't choose the politics of the owner." "Try telling that to a brick through your window," Galt said grimly. "I came to warn you. They're drunk, Eleanor, and they're angry. They tarred and feathered a tidesman near the wharf an hour ago, just for speaking to a redcoat." He grabbed her shoulders. "Get Arthur. Go to the back room. Douse the lights. If they see the shop is dark, maybe they'll pass." "I can't move him easily," Eleanor whispered. "He's weak." "Then pray," Galt said. He turned to leave, his duty done. "I have to get back to my wife. Lock this door, Eleanor. And for God's sake, don't open it again tonight." He slipped back out into the night, leaving a swirl of cold air and terror in his wake. Eleanor threw the bolt. Her hands were shaking so badly, she bruised her thumb on the iron. A friend of the tax. The irony was bitter like bile. Her father was a loyalist, yes, but he was a quiet one. And here she was, harboring a list of treason in the hallway clock, while the mob came to destroy them for being Tories. She stood in the dark shop. The ticking seemed louder now. Aggressive. Tick-tock, tick-tock. They come, they come. She needed to protect the shop. It was all they had. If they smashed the windows, the cold would kill her father before the week was out. If they stole the tools, they would starve. She moved to the window, peering through the gap in the velvet display curtain. The street was empty, but she could hear it now. A low rumble in the distance. Not the ocean. Voices, many voices. A chaotic, rising tide of anger. She looked around the shop. The brass clocks on the shelves caught the faint light from the street lamp outside. They gleamed like gold. To a poor man, angry and drunk, this shop looked like wealth. It looked like the empire. She ran to the counter. She grabbed the heavy woolen throw they used to cover the display case and draped it over the most expensive pieces. She moved the tray of silver pocket watches to the floor, sliding them under the cabinet. "Eleanor." Her father's voice drifted down from the top of the stairs. Weak, confused. "Who was at the door?" She froze. She couldn't tell him. If he knew the mob was coming, he would come down. He would try to stand in the doorway and lecture them on order and law, and they would kill him. "It was just Master Galt, Papa," she called up, forcing her voice to be light. He wanted to borrow some oil. Go back to sleep. "Oil," Arthur muttered. "At this hour, people have no sense of time." She heard his bed creak as he settled back down. Eleanor leaned against the counter, closing her eyes. She was trapped between the fire and the storm. Inside, a dying father who worshipped the king. Outside, a wriggling mob that hated him. And in the middle, in the belly of a silent clock, a list that proved she was on neither side, or perhaps on both. She went back to the kitchen. The fire had burned down to embers. The warmth of the hearth was fading. She grabbed the poker and stirred the logs, coaxing a flame back to life. She needed the light. She needed the heat. She pulled a chair directly in front of the hallway entrance. She sat down, the heavy iron fire poker resting across her lap. She would wait. If the mob came, she wouldn't plea for the king, and she wouldn't plea for liberty. She would plea for the shop. The sound of the crowd grew louder. She could hear individual shouts now, the shattering of glass somewhere down the street. A woman's scream. Eleanor gripped the iron poker until her knuckles turned white. The hearth behind her threw her shadow long and distorted down the hallway, stretching it until it touched the grandfather clock. In that moment, Eleanor Sterling realized that the war had not started on a battlefield. It had started here, in the kitchens, in the shops, in the spaces between neighbors. The candlelight flickered, casting the room into momentary darkness. And in that dark, she realized she was no longer just a clockmaker's daughter. She was a sentry, and her watch had just begun. The silence that followed the passing of the mob was worse than the noise itself. 10 minutes ago, the street outside Sterling and Kobe had been a river of rage. Eleanor had crouched in the dark hallway, the iron fire poker gripped in her sweating palms, listening to the chaotic symphony of shattering glass and drunken roaring. She had heard the sickening crunch of wood as the cooper's door down the lane was kicked in. She had heard the chant, "Liberty and property, no tea, no king!" screamed with a fervor that sounded less like a political slogan and more like a prayer for blood. But they had passed, whether by the grace of God or the simple blind luck of a chaotic herd. The mob had flowed past the clockmaker's shop like floodwater around a stone. They had surged toward the customs house, chasing a rumor of a tax collector hiding in the cellar. Now, the shop was quiet. The only sound was the wind rattling the leaded panes of the display window and the relentless, multi-layered ticking of 100 clocks. Tick-tock, tick-tock. It was the heartbeat of a house that was pretending to be asleep. Eleanor remained in the hallway, seated on the wooden chair she had dragged from the kitchen. Her muscles were coiled tight, aching from the tension. The candle she had blown out earlier sat on the floor, a useless stub of tallow in the dark. "Eleanor?" The voice was thin, drifting down from the landing above. She squeezed her eyes shut for a moment. She had hoped he would sleep through it. "I am here, Papa," she whispered, her voice projecting just enough to reach him, but not the street. "Why is the house dark?" Arthur Sterling asked. His footsteps shuffled on the floorboards overhead. "And what was that infernal racket?" Sounded like a pack of wolves. "Go back to bed, Papa. It was just revelers, sailors from the wharf." "Revelers don't break glass," Arthur grumbled. "It's them, isn't it? The Sons of Liberty. Sons of Bedlam, more like." Eleanor stood up, her knees cracking softly. She needed to intercept him before he came down. If he saw her with a weapon, keeping guard in the dark, the fragile illusion of safety she had built for him would shatter. "It is over, Papa. They are gone. Please, the cold air from the stairwell is bad for your chest." There was a pause. She heard him cough, a wet, rattling sound that seemed to shake the timber frame of the house. "Fine, fine. Check the bolts, girl, and wind the regulator." It sounded slow today. "Yes, Papa." She waited until she heard the creak of his bed ropes. Only then did she exhale. She lowered the poker, leaning it against the wall. Her hands were trembling. She felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to weep, not from sadness, but from the sheer exhaustion of fear. She looked at the grandfather clock standing beside her in the gloom. The list, Julian's list of names. It was still there, inside the casing. A bomb made of paper, ticking silently alongside the brass gears. I should burn it, she thought. I should take it to the hearth, right now, and burn it. She took a step toward the clock. Knock, knock, knock. The sound was sharp, precise. 3 distinct raps on the heavy oak door of the shop. It was not the chaotic pounding of a drunkard or the frenzied battering of a rioter. This was a knock of authority, a knock that expected, nay, demanded an answer. Eleanor froze. The blood that had just begun to return to her face drained away again. She grabbed the poker. She moved silently to the door, pressing her ear against the cold wood. She could hear breathing on the other side. Heavy, labored breathing, and the scuff of a boot on stone. "Who is there?" she asked, her voice steady despite her heart hammering against her ribs. "Open, in the name of the king." The voice was clipped, educated, and undeniably British. Eleanor's grip on the poker loosened, then tightened again. Soldiers. If it had been the mob, she might have feigned illness or simply stayed silent. But one did not refuse the king's men. Not if one wished to remain a loyal citizen. Not if one wanted to keep suspicion away from the house. "One moment!" she called out. She leaned the poker against the wall, hidden behind the umbrella stand. She smoothed her apron. She took a deep breath, trying to compose her features into a mask of sleepy confusion. She slid the top bolt, then the bottom. She opened the door a crack. A gust of freezing wind pushed into the shop, carrying with it the smell of sea salt and gun smoke. Standing on the threshold was a man in a red coat. He was an officer, a captain, by the epaulettes. But he did not look like the pristine figures she saw parading on the common. His wig was askew, his uniform was splattered with mud, and there was a dark, wet stain spreading across the white fabric of his waistcoat. He was leaning heavily against the doorframe, supported by a younger soldier, a private with a terrified look in his eyes. "Captain Hale, 4th Regiment," the officer gasped, his face pale in the moonlight. "I require assistance." Eleanor stared at them. This was not a raid. This was a casualty. "You are hurt," she said, stating the obvious. "A brick," Hale said through gritted teeth. "Thrown by one of your charming neighbors. My men are scattered. I cannot make it back to the barracks like this." He swayed, and the private struggled to hold him up. "Please, miss, just for a moment, until the patrol comes." Eleanor hesitated. If she let them in, she was harboring the enemy of the people who had just marched down her street. If the mob returned and found a British captain bleeding in her shop, they would burn the house down with her inside. But if she refused, she looked at the captain's eyes. They were blue, glazed with pain, but pleading. He was not a symbol of tyranny in that moment. He was just a man with a broken rib and nowhere to go. And her father would never forgive her if she turned away a soldier of the crown. "Bring him in," Eleanor said, stepping back. "Quickly!" The private practically dragged the captain over the threshold. Eleanor slammed the door shut and threw the bolts again, her hands moving with frantic speed. "Into the kitchen," she ordered. "The shop is too cold, and the light can be seen from the street." They shuffled down the hallway. As they passed the grandfather clock, the captain's scabbard clattered loudly against the mahogany case. Eleanor flinched. The list. "Careful!" she snapped, louder than she intended. The captain looked at her, dazed. "My apologies, madam." In the kitchen, Eleanor stoked the fire, coaxing the flames higher. She lit a single candle and set it on the table. In the light, the captain looked worse. His forehead was gashed, blood matting his hairline. But he was clutching his side where the brick must have struck his ribs. "Sit him there," she told the private, pointing to her father's armchair. "No," the captain wheezed. "I will not. Bloody a civilian's chair. The bench." They lowered him onto the wooden bench by the table. He groaned, a low guttural sound that made Eleanor's stomach turn. "I need water," Eleanor said to the private. "There is a pump in the yard, but it's frozen. Use the bucket by the door." She moved into the role of nurse instinctively. It was a role women in the colonies knew well. With doctors scarce and expensive, every kitchen was a triage station. She tore a strip of linen from a rag bag. "I am going to check your head, Captain." Hale nodded weakly. As she dabbed at the cut on his forehead, he watched her. His eyes were clearing, the shock receding to make way for the pain, and the observation. "You are Sterling's daughter?" he asked. His voice was quiet, cultured. "I am." "We know your father," Hale said. "He fixes the regiment's timepieces. A good man, a loyal man." Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the draft. "He is asleep upstairs. He is an invalid." "A pity," Hale murmured. He looked around the kitchen. His gaze lingered on the drying herbs, the copper pots, and then settled on the door, leading back to the hallway. "You were awake, in the dark. I was afraid of the riot." "Wise," Hale said. He winced as she applied pressure to his head. "They are animals tonight. I have fought the French and I have fought the Spanish. But this, fighting a city in its own streets, it is like fighting a ghost. You reach out to strike, and they vanish into the fog." "Why are you here, Captain?" Eleanor asked, her voice tight. "Why not the main guardhouse?" "We were intercepted," the private spoke up from the corner, his voice cracking. "Cut off at Dock Square. The mob split us up. They were throwing cobbles, ice. Captain Hale took a brick to the chest to save me." Hale waved a hand dismissively. "Silence, Jenkins. Don't make me a martyr before I'm dead." He looked back at Eleanor. "We need to wait here until the town watch or a patrol passes. An hour, perhaps. Do you have brandy or whiskey?" "My father keeps a bottle of rum for his cough," Eleanor said. She went to the cupboard. Her hands were steady now. The reality of the situation had settled in. She had 2 British soldiers in her kitchen. If Julian walked in now, if the Sons of Liberty came back. She poured a small measure of rum into a tin cup and handed it to Hale. He downed it in one swallow, coughing as the spirit hit his throat. "Thank you," he breathed. The color was returning to his cheeks. "You should check the front," Hale said to the private. "Watch the street through the curtain. If you see red, signal them. If you see the mob, keep quiet." The private nodded and disappeared into the dark hallway. Eleanor was left alone with the captain. He sat up straighter, adjusting his coat. The vulnerability of the injured man was fading, replaced by the posture of an officer. He began to look around the room with a professional curiosity. "You live a quiet life here, Miss Sterling." "We make clocks, Captain. Precision requires quiet." "Indeed." He tapped his fingers on the table. Tap, tap, tap. "It is a strange thing. Your father is a known Tory, yet this street, this neighborhood, is a hotbed of sedition. Galt the blacksmith, the printer down the lane. You are surrounded by vipers. They are our neighbors," Eleanor said carefully. "We do not discuss politics with them." "No." Hale raised an eyebrow. "Hard to avoid it these days. The very air is political." He stood up, groaning slightly, and walked toward the warmth of the fire. He stood with his back to her, warming his hands. "We have reports," he said softly. "Intelligence, that messages are being passed. Lists, names of men organizing a militia." Eleanor's heart stopped. "Rumors," she said. "Perhaps." Hale turned to face her. The firelight cast his shadow tall against the wall. "But General Haldimand is not a man who believes in ghosts. He believes in paper. He believes that somewhere in this city, there is a list of the ringleaders who plan to stop the tea ships." He took a step toward her. "You are a smart woman, Miss Sterling. You see things, you hear things in the shop. I hear ticking, Captain. And I hear customers complaining about the price of brass. Hale studied her. It was an interrogation. Soft, informal, but an interrogation nonetheless. The boy, Hale said, Julian Thorne, he is a friend of yours? Eleanor forced herself not to blink. He was a friend of my late brother. He was seen, Hale said, his voice dropping to a whisper, tonight, leaving the alleyway beside your shop. Moments before the riot started, Eleanor felt the room spinning. They had been watching. He came to ask for work. Eleanor lied. It was a weak lie. He is looking for employment. Is he? Hale smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. We believe he is looking for trouble. And we believe he was carrying something. Hale walked past her toward the hallway door. Where did the private go? Jenkins! Sir! The private's voice came from the shop front. Hale walked into the hallway. Eleanor followed, her legs feeling like lead. Hale stopped in the middle of the hall. He stood directly in front of the grandfather clock. He placed a hand on the mahogany wood. A beautiful piece, he remarked. Walnut? Mahogany, Eleanor choked out. It's silent, Hale said. He leaned his ear against the glass of the hood. Broken? It has not run in years. My father stopped it when my mother died. A sentimental gesture, Hale said. Or perhaps. He reached for the latch of the waist door, the very door where the list was hidden. Eleanor's vision tunneled. If he opened it, he would see the parchment wedged against the backboard. He would see the names. He would arrest her. He would arrest her father. The shop would be seized. She had to stop him. Captain! She cried out. Hale paused, his hand on the latch. He looked back at her. Yes? Eleanor's mind raced. What could she say? What would stop a soldier from looking inside a clock? It is delicate, she blurted out. The hinges, they are broken. If you open it, the door will fall off. My father, he would be devastated. It is the only image of his wife he has left. It was nonsense, but she said it with such desperate, hysterical conviction that Hale hesitated. He looked at the clock. He looked at Eleanor, seeing the tears standing in her eyes, tears of terror, though he likely mistook them for grief. He slowly removed his hand from the latch. My apologies, he said stiffly. I did not mean to intrude on a shrine. Eleanor let out a breath that was a sob. Thank you. At that moment, a shout came from the street outside. Patrol, it's the 4th, Private Jenkins yelled from the window. Sir, Major Pitcairn's company. Hale straightened up. The pain in his side seemed to vanish under the call of duty. Open the door, Jenkins. The private unbolted the front door. The sound of marching boots and barking orders filled the shop. Hale turned to Eleanor. He bowed, a sharp formal motion. Thank you for the shelter, Miss Sterling. And the rum. Go, Eleanor whispered. Hale stepped onto the threshold. He paused. Tell your friend Mr. Thorne to be careful. The ice on the harbor is thin this time of year. Men disappear easily. He didn't wait for an answer. He walked out into the night, flanked by his private, and was immediately swallowed by the column of redcoats marching past. Eleanor slammed the door. She threw the bolts. Top, bottom. Then she dragged the heavy iron umbrella stand in front of the door. She ran to the hallway. She fell to her knees in front of the grandfather clock. She opened the case. The parchment was there. Innocuous. Deadly. She snatched it up. She ran to the kitchen. The fire was roaring now. She held the paper over the flames. Burn it! Her mind screamed. Burn it and be safe. But then she looked at the names. She saw the name of the man who sold them bread. She saw the name of the doctor who had treated her father. She saw Julian's handwriting. hasty and passionate. If she burned it, she was safe. But if she burned it, the supplies would not be moved. The families of the men on the list would be vulnerable when the port closed. She pulled the paper back from the fire. The corner was singed, brown and curling. She couldn't do it. She was not her father. She was not a loyalist. And she was not a soldier. She was something else, something she hadn't named yet. She folded the paper, smaller this time, tighter. She couldn't keep it in the clock. Hale had touched the clock. It was burned in her mind as a hiding place. She looked around the kitchen. Her eyes landed on the hollow handle of the old iron roasting spit hanging above the hearth. It was covered in soot, greasy, and utterly ignored. She slid the paper inside the hollow metal tube of the spit. She stood back, breathing heavily. Upstairs, she heard her father cough again. "Eleanor, is the wind dying down?" "Yes, Papa," she called out, her voice strong, surprising herself. "The wind is changing direction." She looked at the door where the captain had stood. The knock had come. The enemy had been inside, and she had lied to his face. Eleanor Sterling wiped the soot from her hands onto her apron. The night was only half over, but the girl who had started it was gone. In her place stood a conspirator. The wind off the harbor had turned into a living thing. It clawed at Eleanor Sterling's cloak as she hurried down Union Street, whipping the heavy wool against her legs. Above her, the moon was a sliver of bone white, appearing and disappearing behind racing clouds that looked like smoke from a cannon volley. She kept her head down, her chin buried in her scarf. She was no longer Eleanor, the clockmaker's daughter. Tonight she was a shadow. In the pocket of her petticoat, the list burned against her thigh. She had retrieved it from the hollow iron roasting spit in the kitchen only minutes after Captain Hale had left. The metal had been cold, greasy with soot, but the paper inside was dry. It was the only thing dry in Boston tonight. The city was in a fitful sleep. Shutters were barred, lanterns were extinguished. But Eleanor knew the city wasn't truly asleep. It was waiting. She turned the corner, the smell of malt and stale tobacco hitting her before she even saw the building. And there it was, the Green Dragon Tavern. It was a two-story brick structure that seemed to squat low to the ground, anchoring itself against the tides of history. Hanging from an iron rod above the entrance was the sign, a copper dragon, green with verdigris, swinging violently in the gale. Creak, slam, creak, slam. It sounded like a metronome counting down to a disaster. Eleanor hesitated. The Green Dragon was not a place for women. Not at this hour. Not ever, really. It was the headquarters of the revolution, though no one dared say that aloud. It was a place of rough men, seditious talk, and Freemason secrets. To enter was to cross a line from which there was no return to polite society. But they know, she thought, remembering Captain Hale's eyes. They know about Julian. They know about the list. She pushed the heavy oak door open. The noise hit her like a physical blow. The interior was a haze of pipe smoke, thick and blue, swirling in the yellow light of tallow candles and oil lamps. The air was hot, smelling of roasting meat, spilled ale, and unwashed bodies. For a moment, no one noticed her. The main room was packed. Dock workers in rough canvas jackets sat shoulder to shoulder with merchants in velvet coats. The distinction of class had dissolved here, replaced by the unifying solvent of anger. "I tell you, if the tea lands, we are slaves," a man with a scarred face was shouting, pounding his tankard on a table. "And if we burn it, we are hanged men," another retorted. "Better to hang as free men than starve as vassals." Eleanor stepped further inside, letting the door close behind her. The draft died, but the tension remained. She pulled her hood back slightly, scanning the room. She was looking for Julian Thorne. A hush began to ripple outward from the door. It started with the table nearest to her and spread like a contagion. Men stopped drinking. Arguments died in mid-sentence. Heads turned, a woman, alone, standing in the doorway of the Dragon at 10 o'clock at night. "Lost your way, lass," a burly man near the bar called out. He wore the leather apron of a tanner. "The church is 3 streets over." "I am not looking for a church," Eleanor said. Her voice was trembling, but she forced it to be loud enough to cut through the murmur. "I am looking for Julian Thorne." The name landed in the room like a dropped coin. The tanner's eyes narrowed. "Don't know him." "He is here," Eleanor insisted. She took a step forward. Tell him the clock has stopped." It was a phrase she had heard Julian use once with her brother. A code? A nonsense phrase? She prayed it meant something. The tanner stared at her. Then, slowly, he looked toward the back of the room, toward a heavy wooden door, guarded by 2 men who looked less like drinkers and more like sentries. One of the sentries nodded imperceptibly. "Come with me," the tanner grunted. He stood up, wiping his hands on his apron. He led her through the maze of tables. Men stared at her, some with curiosity, some with suspicion, others with a strange sort of pity. Eleanor kept her eyes fixed on the tanner's broad back. She felt like she was walking the plank of a ship. They reached the back door. The sentry opened it, and the tanner ushered her through. The noise of the tap room vanished instantly as the door closed behind her. She was in a hallway, dimly lit. At the end was another door, this one slightly ajar. Voices drifted out, low, cultured, urgent voices. Eleanor walked toward it. She pushed the door open. It was a private meeting room. A long table dominated the center, covered in maps, broadsheets, and half-empty tankards. Around it sat a dozen men. She recognized them, not personally, but from the whispers of the town. There was Dr. Joseph Warren, fair-haired and elegant, looking exhausted. There was Paul Revere, stocky and intense, his hands stained with silver polish and ink. And there, standing by the fireplace, looking terrified, was Julian. "Eleanor?" Julian dropped the clay pipe he was holding. It shattered on the hearth, the sound sharp as a gunshot. "What are you doing here?" He rushed toward her, grabbing her arms. "Have you lost your mind? If the patrol saw you coming in here..." "The patrol is already at my house, Julian." Eleanor cut him off. Her voice was cold, fueled by the adrenaline that was finally crashing. The room went deadly silent. Dr. Warren stood up slowly. "Explain yourself, Miss Sterling," Warren said. His voice was gentle, but commanded absolute authority. Eleanor pulled away from Julian. She reached into her petticoat and withdrew the folded, slightly soot-stained parchment. She threw it onto the table, right on top of a map of Boston Harbor. "You dropped this," she said to Julian. "Or rather, you gave it to me to hold, and then the British Army came knocking for it." Julian stared at the paper. He turned pale. You had it? When Hale was there?" "Captain Hale sat in my kitchen. He drank my father's rum. And he tried to open the grandfather clock, where I had hidden it first." Eleanor's hands were shaking now. "I had to move it to the roasting spit while he bled on my floor." Paul Revere reached out and picked up the list. He unfolded it, his eyes scanning the names. "It's the roster," Revere said quietly. "The North End Caucus, the mechanics, the volunteers." He looked up at Eleanor, his dark eyes wide. "If Hale had found this, half the men in this room would be in irons by morning. And you, Miss Sterling, you would be in the goal." "I know," Eleanor said. She felt her knees give way, and she sank into the nearest chair. "Get her some water," Warren ordered. "And whiskey." Julian brought her a glass. His hands were shaking as much as hers. "I am sorry, Elle. I didn't mean to bring the war to your door." "The war is already at the door, Julian," she snapped, taking the glass. The whiskey burned, grounding her. "You play at rebellion in the shadows, but tonight I had to lie to a British officer's face. I am done playing." A man at the far end of the table spoke up. He was older, disheveled, with a palsy in his hands but a fire in his eyes. Samuel Adams. She is right, Adams rasped. We are done playing. The Dartmouth is docked. The tea is here. We can no longer whisper in the dark. He looked at Eleanor. You say Hale was at your house. Why? He was injured, Eleanor explained, recounting the events of the evening. The mob, the brick, the shelter she gave him. He suspects Mr. Adams. He knows something is happening. He warned me. He said men disappear on the ice. Haldimand is getting nervous, Revere said, pacing the room. They know we won't let the tea land. They are waiting for us to make a mistake. We need to move the arms, Warren said, tapping the table. The muskets stored at the printing press. If they have this list or even suspect it, they will search the homes of everyone on it. We can't move them tonight, Julian said. The patrols are doubled. We have no choice, Revere slammed his hand down. If they find the powder, we lose before we even begin. Eleanor watched them. They were brave men, yes, but they were men. They thought in terms of force, of muskets, of direct confrontation. They didn't understand the weapon she had used tonight. You don't need to move them, Eleanor said softly. They all looked at her. Excuse me, Miss Sterling, Warren asked. You don't need to move the muskets, she repeated, her voice gaining strength. You just need to change the time. I don't follow, Revere frowned. Eleanor stood up. She walked to the table, looking down at the map of the harbor. Captain Hale trusts my father. He trusts Sterling and Co. because we are the keepers of the regiment's time. We wind their regulators, we fix their watches. She looked at Revere. You are a silversmith, Mr. Revere. You know metal. But I know gears. The British operate on a schedule. The changing of the guard. The patrols. It is all clockwork. If you disrupt the rhythm, you create chaos. And in chaos you can move anything. Go on, Adams said, leaning forward. The patrol that passes the printing shop, Eleanor said, her mind racing, connecting the dots she had observed for years from her shop window. They pass at 10:15, then 10:45, like a pendulum. But tomorrow, my father is scheduled to service the clock at the Old North Church, the one that signals the watch. Your father is ill, Julian noted. I will go, Eleanor said. I often go for him when the weather is bad. I have the keys to the tower. She looked around the room. If the clock at the Old North were to stumble, if it were to chime 10 minutes late, the patrol schedule would shift. The relief guard wouldn't arrive on time. There would be a gap, a window of silence on the street. Revere's face slowly broke into a grin. A blind spot. 10 minutes, Eleanor said. I can give you 10 minutes of darkness tomorrow night. Can you move the muskets in 10 minutes? Revere looked at Warren. Warren looked at Adams. With enough wagons, Julian said, his eyes shining, we could move the moon in 10 minutes. Adams chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. A clockmaker's coup. I like it. It is elegant. And it saves us from a skirmish we are not ready to fight. Dr. Warren approached Eleanor. He looked at her with a new expression. Respect. You realize, Miss Sterling, that if you do this, if you tamper with the king's time, you are no longer a bystander. You are one of us. I think, Eleanor said, touching the pocket where the list had been, that I stopped being a bystander when I didn't burn that list. Good, Warren said. He picked up a quill and dipped it in ink. Then we have a plan. The mood in the room shifted. The despair and tension evaporated, replaced by the frantic energy of action. Maps were redrawn. Timetables were calculated. Eleanor stepped back from the table. She felt suddenly exhausted, the weight of the night crashing down on her. Julian came to her side. I will walk you home, Elle. It's not safe. No, Eleanor shook her head. If we are seen together now, After Hale's warning, it condemns us both. I must go alone. I am just a woman who got lost looking for a church. She turned to the door. Miss Sterling, Paul Revere called out. She paused. The clock, he said. Make it 15 minutes, just to be sure. Eleanor nodded. 15 minutes, but Mr. Revere. Yes? Don't let them land the tea. Over my dead body, Revere promised. Eleanor slipped out of the room, back into the roar of the tap room, and out into the cold, biting wind of Boston. The walk home was a blur. The city felt different now. The cobblestones didn't just feel like stones. They felt like a game board. The shadows weren't just darkness. They were cover. She reached her shop. She unlocked the door with trembling hands and slipped inside. The smell of the house, linseed oil and old wood, greeted her. It was the smell of her childhood, the smell of safety, but it felt fragile now. She walked down the hallway. She stopped in front of the grandfather clock. She reached out and touched the glass face. 15 minutes, she whispered to the silent pendulum. Upstairs, she heard her father cough. The sound was weak, pathetic. He was dreaming of an empire that kept order, of a king who protected his subjects. He didn't know that downstairs, his daughter had just promised to break the very time he worshipped. Eleanor blew out her candle. She did not sleep that night. She lay in her bed, listening to the wind howl, waiting for the dawn. Waiting for the day she would climb the tower and turn the gears of history with her own two hands. The whispers at the Green Dragon were no longer just whispers. They were the first rumble of thunder. Here is Chapter 6, Secrets Sealed in Wax. Author's note: continuing the immersive, high-detail narrative style suitable for a novella. This chapter bridges the gap between the decision to act and the execution of the plan, focusing on the tension of espionage within the domestic sphere. Shadows of Liberty. Candlelight in Old Boston. Chapter 6. Secrets Sealed in Wax. The morning sun over Boston was not warm. It was merely bright. It struck the frost on the window panes of Sterling and Comey, turning the glass into sheets of blinding, fractured diamond. Eleanor stood at the workbench, her hands moving with the rote muscle memory of a lifetime. She was filing a brass escapement wheel, the metal screeching softly against the steel file. Scritch, scritch, scritch. Her eyes, however, were gritty with lack of sleep. The previous night's visit to the Green Dragon Tavern felt like a fever dream. Had she really stood in a room with Samuel Adams and promised to alter the flow of time itself? Had she really committed treason over a glass of whiskey? Looking around the shop now, in the unforgiving light of day, the rebellion seemed impossible. The shop was a sanctuary of order. Her father sat in his corner by the stove, examining a pocket watch through his loop, his breathing wheezy but steady. The world was normal, and yet in her pocket she carried the weight of the promise. 15 minutes. Eleanor. Arthur Sterling's voice cut through the scratching of the file. The post has come. A boy brought it while you were in the cellar. Eleanor froze. She set the file down. The post? We rarely get letters, Papa, unless it's a bill. It's not a bill, Arthur said, his voice laced with a strange mixture of pride and anxiety. He held up a thick envelope of creamy parchment. It bears the seal of the Christchurch vestry and the governor's crest. Eleanor felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. Christchurch, the Old North, the very target of her mission. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked over. May I see? Arthur handed it to her. The paper was heavy, expensive. On the back, a blob of red sealing wax, stamped with the intricate lion and unicorn of the royal governor's office, sat like a drop of congealed blood. Open it, girl. My hands are too stiff for the wax. Eleanor took the letter. The wax was hard and cold. Secrets sealed in wax, she thought. What do they know? She broke the seal. It cracked with a sharp snap that sounded too loud in the quiet shop. She unfolded the parchment. Her eyes scanned the elegant looping calligraphy of a professional scrivener. To Master Arthur Sterling, horologist, by order of General Haldimand and the vestry of Christ Church, you are hereby summoned to inspect the great clock in the bell tower immediately. Reports indicate a drift of 2 minutes per diem. Given the necessity of precise coordination for His Majesty's patrols during the current unrest, the time must be absolute. The clock must be regulated and synchronized with the noon gun at Castle William. This task is critical. Failure to ensure accuracy will be viewed as negligence of duty. Signed, Reverend Mather Biles. Eleanor lowered the letter. Her heart was hammering so hard she thought her father must hear it. They didn't suspect sabotage. They just wanted accuracy. But the timing, it was diabolical. They wanted the clock fixed today because they were planning something tonight. The very night she had promised Paul Revere she would make the clock fail. If she made the clock late now, after being explicitly ordered to fix it, it wouldn't look like an accident. It would look like an act of war. What does it say? Arthur asked, leaning forward. It is a work order, Papa, Eleanor said, her mind racing. The Old North clock. They say it is drifting. I knew it. Arthur slapped his knee, a flush of professional vindication coloring his pale cheeks. I told the sexton last month the pendulum bob was too light for this winter air. Thermal contraction, Eleanor. It speeds up the beat. He tried to stand, bracing himself on the arms of his chair. Get my coat and the heavy tool bag. I must go. Papa, no, Eleanor said quickly, putting a hand on his shoulder. You cannot go up that tower. It is 100 steps. The damp air will kill you. It is a governor's order. Arthur wheezed, his eyes wide with fear. If I refuse, they will think I am with the rebels. They will revoke our license. I will go, Eleanor said firmly. Arthur hesitated. He looked at her, really looked at her, as if measuring her against the task. It is heavy work, Eleanor. The weights are stone. I have done it before, she reminded him. When you had the fever last year. I know the movement as well as you do. I will take the letter. I will show them the seal. I will fix the clock. Arthur sank back into the chair, defeated by his own frailty. He coughed, a deep rattling sound. You are a good daughter, Eleanor. Better than I deserve. Do it right. Regulate it to the second. We must show them that the Sterlings are reliable subjects. Yes, Papa, she whispered. Reliable. She took the letter and turned away. She went to the workbench to pack the tool bag. Hammers, files, oil, pliers, and a small, heavy lead weight she used for fishing lines. She slipped the weight into the bottom of the leather bag. The walk to the north end was a gauntlet. The city was on edge. Squads of soldiers stood at every major intersection, stopping carts and checking papers. The tea crisis had turned Boston into an occupied fortress. Eleanor clutched the letter with the governor's seal against her chest like a shield. It worked. When a corporal stopped her at the bridge over the Mill Creek, she flashed the red wax seal. He waved her through without a word, though his eyes lingered on her face. She reached the Old North Church just before noon. The brick structure rose majestically above the wooden tenements, its white steeple piercing the gray sky. It was a beautiful building, a symbol of Anglican power in a Puritan city. She found the sexton, a sour-faced man named Mr. Finch, sweeping the steps. Master Sterling sent me, Eleanor said, presenting the letter. He is indisposed. Finch squinted at the letter, then at her. A woman? To fix the great clock? Unless you wish to climb the tower and explain to General Haldimand why his patrols are out of sync, Mr. Finch. I suggest you give me the keys. Finch grumbled, fishing a ring of heavy iron keys from his belt. Be quick about it, and don't mess with the bells. The ringers are practicing tonight. Eleanor took the keys. I will be invisible. She entered the church. It was cold inside, colder than the street. The air smelled of old hymnals and damp stone. She walked past the high box pews, their doors closed tight like little fortresses for the wealthy. She reached the door to the tower in the back. She unlocked it and began the climb. The stairs were narrow, wooden, and steep. Creak, thud, creak, thud. As she climbed, the sounds of the city faded, replaced by the wind whistling through the louvers of the steeple. She passed the bell chamber, where the massive bronze bells hung silent in their yokes. They looked like sleeping giants. Finally, she reached the clock room. It was a small, dusty chamber, dominated by the movement, a massive frame of iron and brass. Gears the size of dinner plates meshed together. The pendulum, a long rod of iron with a heavy bob, swung back and forth with a hypnotic, powerful rhythm. Tick, tock, tick, tock. The sound was physical. It vibrated in her chest. Eleanor set down her bag. She checked the dial on the internal face. It matched her own pocket watch. The clock was actually keeping perfect time. The letter had been a ruse, or perhaps an exaggeration by a nervous officer. She stood before the machine. It was a masterpiece of engineering. To sabotage it felt like a sin against her trade. "Forgive me," she whispered to the gears. She took out the oil can. She lubricated the pivots, doing the job she was sent to do. If anyone checked, the fresh oil would prove she had been there to maintain, not destroy. Then, she took out the small lead fishing weight she had brought. The way to slow a clock is to lengthen the pendulum. Gravity acts on the length. The longer the rod, the slower the swing. But she couldn't lengthen the iron rod. However, she could change the center of gravity. She looked at the pendulum bob. It was a heavy iron lens. If she taped the lead weight to the bottom of the bob, it would effectively lower the center of gravity just enough. But tape would be seen. It was too crude. She looked at the adjustment nut at the bottom of the pendulum. It was threaded. She took her wrench. She began to turn the nut, lowering the bob. 1 turn. That was 10 seconds a day. 2 turns. 20 seconds. She needed 15 minutes by tonight. This method was too slow. It would take days to lose that much time. She needed a mechanical slip. She climbed up to the motion works, the gears that drove the hands. There was a friction clutch that allowed the hands to be set without stopping the clock. If she loosened the clutch just a fraction, the gears would turn, but the hands would slip. They would lag behind the driving force. It was unpredictable, but effective. She reached in with her pliers. She gripped the tension spring. "Don't do it!" The voice came from the trapdoor in the floor. Eleanor jumped, dropping the pliers. They clattered into the machinery, bouncing off a cast-iron spoke with a deafening clang. She spun around. Rising from the stairwell was a man. He was dressed in a dark wool coat, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. He brushed the dust from his shoulders as he stepped onto the platform. It wasn't Mr. Finch, and it wasn't a soldier. "Julian," she breathed. Julian Thorne took off his hat. He looked wild. His hair was wind-blown, his eyes dark with lack of sleep. "I followed you from the shop. You followed me? Are you mad? If the soldiers saw you, I had to stop you," Julian said, stepping closer. The noise of the pendulum was loud between them. Tick, tock. "The plan is off, Eleanor." "Off? What do you mean off? I am here. I have the wrench in my hand." "The British know," Julian hissed. "Not about the clock, about the movement of the arms. They've set a trap. If we move the wagons tonight, even with the clock delayed, they'll be waiting at the neck. They have a double guard posted." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. "How do you know?" "Dr. Warren has a source. High up, A letter was intercepted this morning. Eleanor stared at him. A letter? Yes, sealed in wax, just like the one you carry. Julian pointed to the parchment sticking out of her tool bag. Haldimand is playing a game, Eleanor. He wants us to move. He wants to catch the leaders in the act. Eleanor looked at the gears. The pliers were still lodged precariously near the escapement. So, I do nothing? I just fix the clock and go home? No, Julian said. He moved to the small louvered window that looked out over the city. The plan has changed. We aren't moving the muskets tonight. We are moving information. He turned back to her. Adams wants to send a signal to the committees in the countryside to let them know the tea is here and the port might close. We need riders to go out tonight. Revere, Dawes! What does that have to do with me? They can't leave the city if the patrols are synchronized, Julian said. The bridge is blocked. The neck is blocked. The only way out is by water, past the Somerset man-of-war. And the Somerset watches the tides, Eleanor realized. And they watch the church clock, Julian corrected. They change the watch on the ship based on the bells of the Old North, if you can make the clock strike. Strangely, it creates confusion, not silence. Confusion. Strangely? Make it strike 13, Julian said. Eleanor stared at him. 13. At midnight, when the watch changes on the ship. If the clock strikes 13, the sailors will think it's a bad omen, or a malfunction. They will hesitate. They will check their own hourglasses. In that confusion, a small boat can slip under their bow. Eleanor looked at the strike train of the clock. It was a complex mechanism of levers and racks. To make it strike 13, she would have to bend the rack hook. It was risky. If she bent it too far, the clock might never stop striking. It would ring until the weight hit the floor. If I do that, Eleanor said, everyone will know it was tampered with. Finch will know. My father will know. Yes, Julian said softly. There is no hiding this time. If you do this, you burn your bridge, Eleanor. He reached out and took her hand. His palm was warm, rough. You can walk away. Fix the clock. Be the dutiful daughter. No one will blame you. Eleanor looked at the massive gears. She thought of her father, terrified in his chair, clutching his work order. She thought of Captain Hale, bleeding in her kitchen, confident in his power. She had spent her whole life measuring time, dividing it into neat, safe seconds. But time wasn't safe, it was running out. She pulled her hand away from Julian. She knelt down and reached into the machinery. She found her pliers. Get out of here, Julian, she said, her voice steady. Eleanor, go. If you are here when I do this, you will be caught. I have a pass. I can claim it was an accident. A mechanical failure. You cannot. She looked up at him. Tell Mr. Revere to have his boat ready. At midnight, the Old North will speak. Julian looked at her for a long moment, a mix of awe and fear in his eyes. He nodded once, put his hat back on, and disappeared down the trapdoor. Eleanor was alone again. She turned to the strike train. The snail cam was shaped like a spiral. The rack fell onto it to count the hours. She needed to heat the metal to bend it, without snapping it. She took out her small spirit lamp, used for heating shellac, and lit it. The blue flame hissed. She held the flame under the steel lifting arm. The metal turned dull red. Secrets sealed in wax, she thought. And now, secrets forged in fire. She took the pliers and applied pressure. The metal groaned. She bent the stop pin just a fraction of an inch. Just enough to let the rack fall one extra tooth. 12 plus 1. She extinguished the lamp. The smell of hot oil and metal filled the small room. She repacked her bag. She oiled the pivots one last time to leave the scent of maintenance. She stood up and dusted off her skirt. She checked her reflection in the glass of the clock face. She looked the same. Pale, tidy, unremarkable, but she knew the truth. She descended the stairs. Mr. Finch was waiting at the bottom. "Done already?" he sneered. "The escapement was dry," Eleanor said, handing him the keys. "I oiled it. It should keep perfect time now." "It better," Finch grumbled. "The general is watching." "Oh, I am sure he is," Eleanor said. She walked out of the church and into the bright, cold afternoon. She didn't go straight home. She walked to the harbor. She stood on the wharf and looked out at the Somerset, the massive British warship, anchoring the blockade. Its cannons bristled in the sun. She looked at the men on the deck. They were checking their watches. Wait, she thought. Just wait. She put her hand in her pocket. The governor's letter was still there. She pulled it out. She walked to the edge of the wharf. There was a fire burning in an iron brazier where some fishermen were warming their hands. Eleanor walked up to the fire. "Cold day, miss," a fisherman said. "Freezing," Eleanor agreed. She tossed the letter with the red wax seal into the fire. She watched the wax melt. The lion and the unicorn dissolved into a shapeless red puddle, dripping into the ash. The paper curled, blackened, and vanished. Her orders were gone. Her alibi was gone. Now, there was only the clock. And the midnight hour. She turned and walked back toward the shop, listening to the city. Tick, tock. Tonight, the rhythm would break. Province House did not look like a home. It looked like a fortress dressed in lace. Standing at the top of Milk Street, the 3-story brick mansion loomed over the city, its chimney stacks puffing white smoke into the ink-black sky. While the rest of Boston huddled in the dark to save on whale oil and firewood, Province House blazed. Every window was a rectangle of golden defiance, spilling light onto the snow-dusted lawn where the bronze Indian archer on the weather vane aimed his arrow eternally at the heavens. Eleanor Sterling stood at the iron gates, clutching her shawl tight against her throat. The wind had sharpened since noon, carrying the biting promise of snow. In her pocket, wrapped in velvet, was the Royal Repeater, a gold pocket watch belonging to General Haldimand himself. It had been dropped off at the shop 2 days ago with a broken mainspring. The repair was finished, and the summons had been explicit. Deliver upon completion, regardless of the hour. The general requires time. The irony was not lost on her. She had spent the afternoon sabotaging the city's greatest clock, and now she was delivering a masterpiece of precision to the man who occupied her city. "State your business," a sentry barked from the gatehouse. He wore a thick wool greatcoat over his uniform, his breath pluming in the torchlight. "Eleanor Sterling, of Sterling and Company," she said, her voice swallowed by the wind. "I have General Haldimand's timepiece." The sentry squinted at her, then at the small box in her hand. "The general is at the ball. He's not seeing tradespeople." The order was specific. Eleanor lied smoothly, channeling the same cold confidence she had used at the church. "He intends to present it as a gift tonight. If I fail to deliver it, I shall tell him it was Sentry." She glanced at his badge number. "Sentry Miller, who delayed me." The soldier grunted, annoyed but unwilling to risk the wrath of a general. He unlocked the pedestrian gate. "Servants' entrance, round the back. And wipe your feet, girl. The floors are polished." Eleanor stepped through. The gravel crunching under her boots sounded too loud, too exposing. As she rounded the corner of the mansion, the sound of the city, the wind, the distant barking of dogs, was replaced by a surreal auditory assault. Music. It was a minuet, played by a string quartet. Violins, a cello, a harpsichord. The melody was precise, mathematical, and utterly alien to the starvation occurring a mile away. It filtered through the glass of the conservatory, accompanied by the high, crystalline laughter of women and the low rumble of men. Eleanor reached the servant's door and knocked. It was opened instantly by a harried steward in a powdered wig that was shedding dust onto his shoulders. "What now? The oysters? If it's the oysters, tell the fishmonger he's late and I'll have his ears." "I am the clockmaker," Eleanor said, stepping into the warmth. The heat hit her like a physical wall. The air inside smelled of beeswax, roasting pheasant, expensive French perfume, and the heavy metallic tang of red wine. It was a suffocating luxury. "The clockmaker," the steward blinked, confused. "We didn't send for a clockmaker. The tall clock in the hall is chiming perfectly." "General Haldimand's watch," Eleanor explained, holding up the box. "I was told to wait for his personal receipt." The steward sighed, a sound of profound exhaustion. "Fine, fine. Wait in the library anteroom. Do not wander. Do not touch the silver. And, for God's sake, don't let the guests see your boots. They're muddy." He gestured vaguely toward a narrow corridor, lined with dark oak paneling. Eleanor walked down the hall. The floor was covered in a Turkish runner, so thick it felt like walking on moss. On the walls, portraits of King George II and Queen Caroline stared down at her with heavy-lidded indifference. She reached the anteroom. It was a small space, essentially a holding pen for the less important visitors, separated from the main ballroom by a set of double doors that were slightly ajar. She sat on a stiff velvet chair, placing the watchbox on her lap. From here she could see into the ballroom. It was a spectacle. Hundreds of candles burned in the crystal chandeliers, multiplying the light in the gilded mirrors until the room seemed to be on fire. The floor was a sea of silk and satin. There were scarlet coats, navy naval uniforms, and gowns of canary yellow, emerald green, and crushed violet. But it was the faces that held her attention, or rather, the lack of them. It was a masquerade. The guests wore masks of velvet, leather, and papier-mâché. Some were elegant domino masks of black silk that hid only the eyes. Others were grotesque, beaks of birds, snouts of boars, the grinning faces of court jesters. Eleanor watched from the shadows. She felt a surge of revulsion. While the Sons of Liberty met in dark basements, hiding their faces to save their lives, these people hid their faces for amusement. They played at anonymity while the city outside choked on their laws. "A grotesque display, is it not?" The voice came from the corner of the anteroom, deep in the shadow of a bookshelf. Eleanor started, clutching the box. A man stepped forward into the sliver of light. He was not wearing a mask. He was dressed in the uniform of a British captain, but his coat was unbuttoned at the top, and his arm was in a sling. It was Captain Hale. He looked pale, the gash on his forehead from the previous night, now stitched and covered with a strip of plaster. He held a glass of amber liquid in his good hand. "Captain," Eleanor said, standing up, I did not see you. I have a talent for being unseen," Hale said dryly. He swirled his drink. "Or perhaps you were just too mesmerized by the zoo in there." He gestured with his glass toward the ballroom. "Look at them. The peacock, the lion, the fox. Aesop would have a field day." "I am here to deliver a watch," Eleanor said defensively. "To the general," Hale nodded. "I know. I saw you arrive at the gate. I was, taking some air." He moved closer. He smelled of brandy and medicinal salve. "You are a bold woman, Miss Sterling. Most civilians would not dare approach the lion's den tonight. The streets are unwelcoming." "The general pays his bills," Eleanor said, "which is more than I can say for some of my neighbors." Hale chuckled, but his eyes remained cold and analytical. "Touché. But tell me, did you burn it?" Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. "Burn what, Captain?" "The list," Hale whispered. "The paper in the clock. The one I so rudely almost discovered." Eleanor forced herself to meet his gaze. She didn't blink. "I don't know what you are talking about." You were delirious with pain, Captain. You imagined ghosts in the machinery. Hale studied her. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound was the strain of a violin from the other room, and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the main hall. Perhaps, Hale murmured, pain does strange things to the mind, but I am not in pain now. He took a sip of his drink. General Haldimand is busy. He is dancing with the governor's wife. He likely won't see you for an hour. You are trapped here, Miss Sterling. I am patient. Are you? Hale tilted his head. You seem agitated. Your pulse is visible in your neck. Are you worried about the time? Or are you worried about what happens at midnight? Eleanor felt the blood freeze in her veins. Midnight. Did he know? Did he know about the church tower? I am worried about my father, she deflected. He is alone. Your father is a good man, Hale said. A man of order. He understands that a clock must run true. If a gear slips, if a hand points to the wrong hour, the whole machine fails. He stepped closer, invading her personal space. We have doubled the guard at the neck, Eleanor. We have a cutter patrolling the Charles River. If anyone tries to move anything tonight, be it tea, muskets, or information, they will be caught. He leaned down, his voice a whisper near her ear. And the Somerset is watching the Old North. If so much as a lantern flickers in that tower, we will open fire. Tell your friends. Eleanor stood rigid. He knew. He didn't know exactly what she had done, but he knew the tower was the focal point. I have no friends, Captain, she said softly. Only customers. Hale pulled back. He looked at her with a strange mixture of admiration and pity. For your sake, I hope that is true. Before he could say more, the double doors to the ballroom swung open. A burst of laughter and music spilled into the quiet anteroom. A large man in a scarlet coat, his chest heavy with gold braiding, strode out, followed by a shorter man in a velvet suit. Governor Hutchinson. It was General Haldimand. He wore a mask, a Roman centurion's face, frozen in gold. He pulled it off as he entered the room, revealing a flushed, sweating face. Damned heat, Haldimand grumbled. Hutchinson, you keep your house like a furnace. It pleases the ladies, General, Hutchinson replied, fanning himself with his tricorn hat. Haldimand spotted Hale. Ah, Captain. Still standing? You should be in bed. I am fit for duty, sir. Hale straightened, wincing slightly. Haldimand's eyes then shifted to Eleanor. He frowned. And who is this? One of the kitchen maids lost her way. Eleanor Sterling, sir. Eleanor curtsied, sinking low to hide the trembling of her knees. Sterling and Company, I have brought your repeater. Ah! Haldimand's face brightened. The Swiss movement. Finally. He marched over, extending a large, fleshy hand. Eleanor placed the velvet box in his palm. Haldimand opened it. The gold watch gleamed in the candlelight. He pressed the stem. Ding, 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 ding. The watch chimed the quarter hours. The sound was pure, sweet, and tiny. Exquisite, Haldimand murmured. Your father is a wizard, girl. He is, Eleanor agreed. Haldimand checked the face of the watch against the large clock in the hall. It is perfectly synchronized. Excellent! He closed the watch and slipped it into his waistcoat pocket. He looked at Eleanor. You came through the dark to bring this? Brave. Foolish, Hutchinson muttered. The streets are not safe. The streets are mine, Haldimand declared, his voice booming. And tonight, we shall prove it. He turned to Hale. Captain, are the signal rockets ready? Eleanor's breath hitched. Signal rockets? Yes, General, Hale said, his eyes flicking briefly to Eleanor. On Copp's Hill and on the deck of the Somerset. Good. Haldimand grinned, a predatory expression. At the stroke of midnight, when the watch changes, we will launch a illumination flare. We shall light up the harbor like noon. If those rats are trying to smuggle anything by water, they will be spotted instantly. Eleanor felt the floor sway beneath her. Flares. At midnight. If the Somerset launched flares at midnight, the harbor would be bright as day. Paul Revere's boat, the boat she was supposed to protect by creating confusion, would be seen. The confusion she had engineered at the church tower wouldn't matter if the sky itself was on fire. Unless the Somerset was confused before they could launch. If the church clock struck 13 before the ship's bell rang, the sailors on deck might hesitate. They might look at the tower. They might miss the signal to light the fuses. But Haldimand had just said the flares were timed to the stroke of midnight. She needed to leave. She needed to warn someone. Or she needed to pray that her 13 strikes caused enough chaos to delay the order. I should go, General, Eleanor stammered. My father waits. Nonsense, Haldimand waved a hand. It is too dangerous. The patrols are arresting anyone on the street after 10. You shall stay. Stay? Eleanor horrified. In the kitchens, Haldimand said generously. The cook will give you some supper. You can sleep by the hearth. You will leave in the morning when the sun is up. But sir, that is an order, Miss Sterling, Haldimand said, his voice losing its warmth. I will not have a young woman wandering my perimeter and distracting my sentries. Hale, escort her to the kitchen and ensure she stays there. Eleanor looked at Hale. He was smiling, a tight, humorless smile. With pleasure, General, Hale said. Eleanor was trapped. Haldimand and Hutchinson turned back to the ballroom. Come, Governor. I believe they are playing a gavotte. Let us dance while the rebels freeze. The doors swung shut, muffling the music once more. Eleanor stood alone with Captain Hale. The kitchen, Hale said, gesturing to the dark corridor. It is warm, and there are no clocks to fix. Eleanor didn't move. Her mind was racing. It was 10:30. She had 90 minutes. She was stuck in the governor's mansion, guarded by the man who suspected her most. You enjoy this, she said quietly. I enjoy order, Hale said. And keeping you here ensures order. Move. He placed a hand on her elbow, lightly but with unmistakable force, and guided her back toward the servants' quarters. The kitchen was a chaotic hive of activity. Cooks were shouting, scullery maids were scrubbing pots, and footmen were hauling trays of wine. The heat was oppressive. Sit here. Hale pointed to a stool near the pantry. Do not leave. I will inform the sentry at the back door that you are a guest of the state. If you try to exit, you will be arrested for espionage. He leaned in close. And, Eleanor, I will be watching. Hale turned and walked out, the tails of his red coat swirling. Eleanor sat on the stool. A cook shoved a plate of cold ham and bread into her hands. Eat up, girl, and stay out of the way. She looked at the food. She couldn't eat. She looked at the small clock on the mantel over the roasting spit. 10:35. The royal repeater in Haldimand's pocket was ticking perfectly. The signal rockets were waiting on the hill. The Somerset was waiting in the harbor. And Julian and Revere were preparing a boat, thinking she had bought them a window of safety. Instead, she had walked into a cage. She looked around the kitchen. Knives, fire, boiling water. It was a place of danger, but also a place of opportunity. Her eyes landed on a row of servants' cloaks hanging by the back door. Rough wool, gray and brown, anonymous. And then she saw it. On a side table, a tray of half-empty wine glasses returned from the ballroom, and next to it, a discarded mask. A black silk domino mask, dropped by a drunk guest or a bored lover. Haldimand had said, "The streets are mine." But he had also said, "I will not have a young woman wandering my perimeter." He wouldn't look for a woman. He wouldn't look for a servant. But would he look for a guest? Eleanor stood up. She wasn't going to wait in the kitchen. If she couldn't leave the house, she would have to go deeper into it. She needed to get to the roof, or a window facing the harbor. She needed to signal Revere herself. She slipped the black mask into her bodice. She waited until the cook turned to yell at a scullery boy. She didn't go to the back door. She turned and slipped into the shadows of the pantry, toward the narrow service stairs that led not down but up to the second floor, up to the ballroom. If it was a masquerade, then she would play. She began to climb. The wooden steps creaked, but the sound was drowned out by the swelling music above. Tick-tock. The game of shadows was over. The masquerade had begun. The fog did not roll into Boston that night. It seized the city. It rose from the harbor like a spectral tide, swallowing the masts of the ships, then the wharves, and finally the streets themselves. It was a cold, saline vapor that tasted of the deep ocean and carried the muffled cries of seagulls that sounded disturbingly like lost children. Julian Thorne stood in the shadow of a warehouse on Griffin's Wharf, his back pressed against the damp wood. He could not see his own boots. The world had been reduced to a gray, swirling void where sound played tricks on the mind. "Can you see the lantern?" Julian whispered, his voice barely audible, even to himself. Beside him, Paul Revere shifted his weight. The stocky silversmith was invisible in the gloom, but Julian could feel the tension radiating from him. "I can't see the hand in front of my face, lad," Revere muttered. "If the Somerset was burning a bonfire on her deck, we'd be lucky to see the glow. Is that good or bad?" "It's both," Revere said grimly. "The fog hides us from the sentries, but it also hides the sentries from us. We could walk straight into a bayonet and not know it until we felt the steel." They were waiting. The plan, the original plan, was for a boat to slip out to the T-ships and disable the rudders. But the news of the double guard had changed everything. Now they were simply watching for the signal flares General Haldimand had promised, watching for the clock to strike, and listening. In the fog, vision was useless. Hearing was the only defense. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The sound was faint, rhythmic, heavy boots on gravel. Julian froze. He placed a hand on the pistol tucked into his belt. The footsteps were coming from the north, moving slowly toward their position. "Patrol," Revere breathed. "2 men, maybe 3. They held their breath. The footsteps grew louder, magnified by the moisture in the air. The fog seemed to pulse with each impact of hobnailed leather on stone. Crunch, stop. The footsteps halted, right on the other side of the warehouse corner. "I heard voices," a British voice said. It sounded weary, distorted by the mist. "Over by the crates." "It's just rats, Jenkins. Or the wind," another voice replied. "This fog is thick enough to choke a man. Let's get back to the brazier. My toes are turning black." "I'm telling you." I heard a whisper. There was the sound of a musket being cocked. The distinct click-clack echoed sharply in the silence. Julian's heart hammered against his ribs. He looked at Revere. The silversmith slowly drew a knife from his boot. They were cornered. If the soldiers rounded the corner, there would be blood. And if shots were fired, the whole garrison would descend on the wharf. The footsteps started again, closer. Julian closed his eyes, preparing for the violence. Then from the distance, muffled, ghostly but unmistakable, came the sound of a bell. It was the Old North Church. Bong! The first strike of midnight. The soldier paused. "Hark! The hour." Bong! "Midnight," the second soldier said. "Time for the relief. Thank God." Bong! Julian counted silently. 3. The soldiers seemed to relax, their boots scraping as they turned slightly, waiting for the bells to finish so they could march back. Bong! Bong. Up in the governor's mansion, Eleanor Sterling was also counting. She was no longer in the kitchen. She was on the second-floor landing, pressed into a velvet alcove, behind a marble bust of Julius Caesar. She had discarded her apron. Over her plain gray dress, she had thrown a black velvet cloak she had found draped over a banister, carelessly left by a drunken guest. On her face was the black silk domino mask. She was trembling, but not from cold. Below her, the ballroom was a kaleidoscope of color and noise. The music had swelled to a crescendo. The dancers were spinning, a blur of silk and laughter. They were oblivious to the woman in the shadows above them. They were oblivious to the starving city outside. But Eleanor had eyes only for the balcony doors on the far side of the room. They led to the terrace. From the terrace, a small iron ladder led to the widow's walk on the roof. That was where the signal rocket was. She had heard Hale give the order to a lieutenant. Set the tripod on the widow's walk. Clear line of sight to the harbor. Light it at the last stroke of midnight. Eleanor checked the long case clock in the hallway. The hands were aligning. Bong! The first chime resonated through the house. The music in the ballroom didn't stop, but the dancers slowed. A murmur of anticipation rippled through the crowd. This was the midnight surprise the general had promised. Eleanor moved. She stepped out of the shadows and into the periphery of the ballroom. She kept her head high, walking with a purpose she didn't feel. The mask was her shield. To the guests, she was just another attendee, perhaps a merchant's wife or a cousin of the governor. She navigated the edge of the dance floor. A man dressed as a court jester reached out to grab her arm. "Dance with me, my dark lady." "I have a promise to keep," Eleanor whispered, pulling her arm away and slipping past him. She reached the balcony doors. They were guarded by a single footman. "Fresh air," she said imperiously, not breaking her stride. The footman, trained to obey the whims of the aristocracy, opened the door for her without a word. Eleanor stepped out into the night. The cold hit her instantly. The fog here was thinner than at the harbor, but it still curled around the stone balustrade like wisps of smoke. She didn't stop. She found the iron ladder tucked into the corner of the brickwork. It was icy, slick with rime. She grabbed the rungs. Her dress was heavy, cumbersome. She hitched it up, tucking the fabric into her belt. She began to climb. Bong! Bong! The clock was striking. She had to hurry. She reached the roof. The wind here was ferocious. It tore at her cloak, trying to throw her off the edge. And there, in the center of the flat lead roof, was the soldier. He was standing next to a wooden tripod. Mounted on it was a Congreve rocket, a vicious tube of gunpowder and iron. He held a lit slow match in his hand, the ember glowing red in the dark. He was looking at his watch, counting the strikes. 10, he muttered. Bong. That was 10. Eleanor looked around. There was no weapon, no loose brick, nothing but the slate tiles and the chimneys. She had to stop him. If that rocket fired, the harbor would be illuminated. The Somerset would see the small fishing boat Revere had hidden in the reeds. 11. Bong. The soldier raised the match toward the fuse. Eleanor didn't think. She lunged. She didn't scream. Screaming would alert the guards below. She threw herself across the few feet of slippery lead roof and slammed her body into the soldier. He hadn't heard her over the wind and the bells. The impact caught him completely off guard. "What the?" They crashed onto the hard roof. The slow match flew from his hand, skittering across the lead tiles, sparking as it went. The soldier was strong. He was trained. He rolled, throwing Eleanor off him as if she were a doll. "Who are you?" he snarled, scrambling to his knees. He reached for his bayonet. Eleanor scrambled back, her hands scraping against the rough slate. Her mask had slipped, hanging from one ear. "It's over," she gasped. "The clock." The soldier ignored her. He saw the match dying on the wet roof. He lunged for it. Bong. 12. "The last stroke," the soldier grunted, grabbing the match. It was still glowing. He turned back to the rocket. Eleanor watched him. She couldn't stop him. He was too far away. But then, bong. The 13th strike. The soldier froze, his hand holding the match inches from the fuse, stopped in midair. He cocked his head. 13, he whispered. He looked at his watch. He looked at the church tower in the distance, invisible in the fog. Was that 13, or did I miscount? Hesitation. It is the most fatal of human flaws. In that second of confusion, the wind gusted violently. A downdraft from the chimney caught the dying ember of the slow match in the soldier's hand. It flickered once and died. The soldier stared at the blackened stick. He cursed. He fumbled in his pocket for his tinderbox. But down in the harbor, the moment had already shifted.